suppose, is broader than what you've been looking at and what I've heard from the last presentation and indeed from looking at the program, and indeed I've entitled my paper, How Many People Do We Need? And what I'd like to do is to look at this broader issue of population here this morning. And can I start with a rhetorical question, and that is this: why is the Rudd government hell-bent on bringing more and more people to Australia?
Votes.
In 2007-8, 173,290 people permanently migrated to Australia. In addition, there are another 544,000 temporary immigrants to the country, and that's excluding the 5 million or so visitors in that year. That's close to 750,000 extra people residing here in a year. According to the Australian Bureau of Statistics, net overseas migration contributed 60.6% of Australia's population growth in 2008, compared to 39.4% contributed by natural increase. Our roads are congested, our public transport overcrowded, our water supply inadequate, and our amenity under threat. Journeys that once took 30 minutes often take an hour. The congestion has spread beyond peak hours to much more of the day in our major cities. Since 1980, the number of cars registered in Australia has almost doubled. In the 30 years from 1973, urban car use increased from 72 billion passenger kilometres to 171 billion. In 1991, 1 million Victorians drove to work. By 2006, more than this number drove to work in Melbourne alone. And the former head of Sydney's road network has suggested the introduction of a London-style tax to reduce congestion in that city. Overcrowded public transport has become the norm. In Melbourne, my home city, public transport patronage has increased significantly since 2000, when there were 351 million boardings. By 2007-8, this figure reached 450 million, with often overcrowded trains, buses and trams. Australia is facing an unprecedented shortage of housing. Underlying housing demand is booming, buoyed by accelerating population growth, while supply continues to be restricted by limited land availability, excessive infrastructure charges and developer uncertainty. In 2006, the Urban Development Institute found that land costs comprised up to 3/4 of the costs of a house and land package, with land supply diminishing in every state in Australia. Lot sizes have been shrinking. The traditional quarter-acre housing block is now little more than a distant memory. A 450 square metre block, characteristic of contemporary greenfields development in Sydney, represents close to 1/9 of an acre. The Institute predicts that, and I quote, "The newly married young couple, the young family with children, the medium-income single person, and the teachers, nurses and police will have few opportunities to purchase in the new high-cost, unaffordable Australian city unless steps are taken to make land more affordable." The Planning Institute's Jason Black recently proposed bulldozing spacious suburban blocks to replace older homes with 3 to 6-storey apartments. The Victorian government has already removed the power of some municipalities to determine planning applications in key development locations, and is proposing a significant increase of housing into green areas. Waiting lists for public housing increased from 202,000 in 1990-91 to 220,000 in 2000-2001, before falling to 177,000 in 07-08. While the current government has promised to increase public housing, population growth will continue to exert pressure on the stock. According to the demographer Graham Hugo, population growth has accounted for around 3/4 of household growth in Australia since 1961. Immigration has accounted for almost 60% of Melbourne's population growth over the past decade. The impact of migration has not been factored into discussions about housing problems. Housing formation will continue to outpace the rate of population growth, with households growing from 6.9 million in 1996 to almost 10 million in 2021. The demand is also driven by the increase in temporary immigrants, including international students and short-term workers. Overseas students' numbers have increased from just 7,351 in 1978 to 537,893 30 years later. International visitors have also increased significantly, rising from 581 in 1978 to 5.6 million in 2008. And there are other consequences. 1 million additional people have settled in Melbourne since the last dam was built, and you can replicate that right around Australia. The number of public hospital beds in Australia has fallen from 62,000 in 1970 to 54,000 in 2008. Now, while this has been offset by an increase in private hospital beds, the numbers have fallen substantially behind the population growth over that period. Ladies and gentlemen, there is one common factor in this development, and that is a growing population. It is time we address these changes, not in the piecemeal fashion that we have today, but as part of a broad national discussion about. This leads me to my second basis for policy, namely that the migration program should be in the national interest. This means that there should be much more research into the impact of immigration on Australia. Much of the research to date has been anecdotal and lacking in empirical rigour. The issues that I raised at the outset of this paper about congestion, infrastructure and amenity should all be addressed as part of any policy consideration, but this is not happening currently. Thirdly, the migration program needs to retain broad community support. This means, among other things, those important settlement aspects of migration, including the comprehension of the English language and the provision of work, are to be reinforced. The Rudd government's policy is bewildering. Not only is the border security policy in tatters, but programs to introduce guest workers are unnecessary and at odds with the long-held community views in this nation. Moreover, there is no rationale for the policy of bringing more and more people to Australia, which leads me to my final point. Australia should have a population policy. The size of our population, the extent and the composition of our immigration program, the capacity of our natural and built environment to cope, and the attitude and the confidence of the Australian people about future directions are all factors to be considered. It is time, ladies and gentlemen, for a national discussion about population. Thank you.